Today's presentation is about Angular in the enterprise and lessons from the trenches. And this is really the talk that I wish that I'd had when I was learning Angular and TypeScript in particular about 18 months ago. So hopefully you can learn some new things from this presentation today, from the lessons that we've learned at SSW over the last 18 months. So as I was saying, my name is Duncan Hunter. I'm a software architect at SSW, and you can catch me on Twitter at DunkHunter. And I have a real focus on Angular and TypeScript. I spend most of my time on the front end, even though I do full stack, building enterprise.NET applications with Angular and TypeScript. Also a passionate rock climber. This is me here on the left. I do have a rope, everyone always asks. This is a few hours south of Sydney. Yeah, if I'm not coding, I'm usually out rock climbing. So this is my goal for us at SSW with front-end applications. I want our front-end code to be as solid as our back-end. And my boss, Adam, says this is a very ambitious goal and it will never be the case, but still it's my goal nonetheless. And also it's often the goal of our product owners. A lot of our clients who I go help building their Angular and TypeScript applications, they usually say, you know, we're really happy with our back-end, we're really solid, we have got amazing architecture, we do dependency injection, we do unit of work, we have unit tests, we're really happy with it, but our front end is just a big ball of spaghetti, can you help? And that's really where frameworks like AngularJS can come in and help. So that's my goal for us. So today's agenda is we're going to run through the 5 questions that you're going to need to ask yourself as a .NET developer whenever you go file new project with Angular. So those 5 questions will be, should you use Angular at all? That's the first question. Second question, how do you structure your application and how do you get that right? 3, will you use TypeScript or ECMAScript 6? How will you use a task runner and a package manager versus NuGet? And how will you get ready for Angular 2 because it's just around the corner? So let's take a brief walk down memory lane of front-end development. Front-end development really started in 1995 when Brendan Eich from Netscape wrote the initial version of JavaScript in only 2 weeks. And then in 1997 we got ECMAScript, which is the formal committee for pushing the JavaScript language forward. And then in 2002 we got XHR requests, which came from the Outlook team at Microsoft. And this was a really important time because it was the first time we were able to do requests without doing a page refresh. And this was really important for usability. In 2004, we saw Google Maps come out, and this was a bit mind-blowing, not because it used AJAX requests, but just in the way that the application worked in terms of user experience and the ability to get a great user experience by really leveraging AJAX requests and not having to do a browser refresh. In 2006, we got jQuery, and jQuery was the first time that we saw the big guys like Google and Apple and Microsoft all agree to use the same framework rather than just going, oh, we're going to roll our own again. So that was a really important time, and jQuery is still arguably the most popular front-end library available. In 2008, we got the Chrome and V8 engine from Google, and this is really important because the web got a lot faster. We're getting more ambitious with pushing more of our web applications towards the browser. 2009 we got Node.js, and this is important for us .NET developers because not only did it bring a whole lot of innovation in the way that we do development in general, but also tooling like NPM as a package manager. 2010 we got Knockout, and we built a fair few applications at SSW and Knockout, but it's now been knocked out per se by Angular, which started in 2011. Actually more like 2009 if you go way back, and it's getting old. It's 6 years old now, and that's why we're starting to see Angular 2 come on the scene to incorporate all the lessons they've learnt, and also the big changes coming with ECMAScript 6 or JavaScript 2015. So life before front-end frameworks, well, it was a lot of this. It was a lot of spaghetti code, and this spaghetti code was mostly because there was no structure, and we ended up with a lot of inline JavaScript and no separation of concerns, a lot of poor code reuse, and we created a lot less responsive applications. And this all led to applications being difficult to maintain and just too many page refreshes and poor usability. And this is, like I was saying, what I hear from our product owners. They wish that their front-end code was more structured. And it's not that we couldn't do this, it was just that we would prefer not to make very complicated front ends because they were difficult to maintain. So that's been fixed a lot by a lot of these newer front-end frameworks, which give us a lot more structure, and leads us to our first question is, if we are choosing a front-end framework, should we use AngularJS? And one of the big things you need to look at is how popular Angular is. Not just other people are using it, so I should use it, but this was a comment made this week by Brad Green from the Angular team at the Angular conference that's on, saying 1.1 million developers every day go to the Angular website. So that's a lot of developers, and it just shows you how popular and how much of a community there is around Angular at the moment. And this is a really big decision, part of the decision-making process of should you use it. There's loads of tutorials, there's loads of third-party libraries, there's a lot of people using it, and it gives you confidence to know that it's going to keep running. It's not something that's going to fizzle out when it's got this much momentum. You can see here a chart of popularity based against other frameworks like Backbone and Knockout and Aurelia, and you can see that Angular is clearly dominating this space. And one of the reasons the major reason I feel it's clearly dominating this space is because it's a complete solution. You don't just get one thing from Angular, you don't just get two-way binding, you get a whole bunch of stuff I'm about to run through. And for this reason, I think it's the most popular, is because it's such a complete solution. You don't have to pull together all of these parts from different libraries and hack them all together, which might be a better application, but your team might not have the time and the experience to make your own sort of framework from 10 different other libraries. So being a complete solution, you get routing out of the box, which is great. Even simple things like being able to manage browser history would be quite complicated without some sort of library or framework, and Angular gives you that out of the box, as you can see here in red, being able to know all of your browser history, even though you're on a single page app and you've done no page refreshing. As part of that complete solution with Angular, you get an MV star structure and guidance. It's not quite MVC, it's more MV star, so you get a view, and we get our templates, and we get access to the DOM, and we get directives, which are fantastic for giving us the ability to write our own components. We get a view model where we can attach all of our objects to be ready to represent onto our view, and we get controllers and models, and in that we get ability to do things on our front end like we would do on our back end, like having a service or a factory. So as you can see here, we get a lot of structure by pulling in Angular. We get this MV star-like structure, which moves us away from having a spaghetti structure. So in Angular, we get two-way data binding, and we solve this problem of data binding to the DOM being painful. And you can see here some jQuery that I've used, and this is a recent piece of jQuery I wrote for an older MVC application we have at SSW. And basically, I'm using a query selector to find by ID a certain part of the page, and then append onto it a message. And this is fine, but if you're going to have to do a lot of this and update it when this message changes, it's not as easy to read, and it's much more harder to maintain. And Angular really solved this by providing two-way data binding. It's one of the most popular parts of Angular, is this two-way data binding. We get to do things like this. We have an input box or element, and we can just say ng model equals vm.transfer amount, and we can just bind onto that input. And if that input changes, it'll let us know, and if we change that input, it's instantly bound to the model. So nice syntax, and really means we have to write a lot less code. And we also get a lot of helper directives like this one here, this ng change, which will send an event to our controller to let us know when this value changes in the input field, and call off this function, calculate remaining balance. So you can see here that this binds onto the controller, this transfer amount, and we're initializing it to a default number of 0. And this controller might look a little bit different than the normal Angular controllers in Angular 1 you've seen, because it's written in TypeScript, which we'll talk a lot more about in a second. And you can see here we're binding onto this function. So if this input field changes, we'll call this calculate remaining balance function on our controller. So this two-way data binding is excellent. It works by running a digest cycle. So when an event triggers this digest cycle, the framework does a dirty check. And when it does that dirty check, then it re-renders anything that's changed. And this in general is very fast and is one of the great things about Angular 1. But it is changed in Angular 2, so hold on to the end of this talk to learn more about that. So as part of a complete solution, we get lots of these directives and functionality out of the box. One example is server communication with the HTTP service from Angular. And part of that service, we get this nice syntax to be able to do .get here with a promise callback. We get HTTP interceptors. So if we want to be able to intercept a HTTP request before and after and during, we can do that. And we can even mock it, and we get this HTTP backend. So the reason I'm showing this is to emphasize that if you're using other frameworks, you might get one of these things, you might get none of them, and you might have to pull in another library. But as part of a complete solution, you get all of this. And if you've got a problem with Angular 1 at the moment, being such a huge community, I'm sure you'll find a solution online in about 5 minutes of Googling. Now, my favorite thing about Angular 1, and what will also be a favorite in Angular 2, is custom components. And we call them directives in Angular 1. And you get to do things like this, where you say SIP-main menu, and this is a custom element that has all the logic for the side menu for this application. And what you're looking at here is the master layout page for an Angular application we've written. And you can see it's very small. We've also got another directive for showing global alerts and also for the footer. So rather than jamming all of that logic into the master layout page, we can pull that out and have a nice separation of concerns by writing these custom directives. And this is one of the reasons why Angular has become so popular, is this ability to write custom directives. Now, what you can see here, or hardly see, is a layout.cshtml page from an MVC page that we have, that I contribute to, and it's huge. It's like 500 lines long, and you can't even read it. And it's not that we couldn't make this better, it's more that it doesn't lend itself so easily as Angular does to pulling out some of the logic that's in this huge layout page and put it into its own sections. So you also get dependency injection out of the box. You can see here an example of injecting an item service and a shipping calculator service. So that's something that was very popular. Also, we get an ability to test our code, so it's easy to make unit tests or spec files. We get an ng mock library, and we get great tools like Protractor, Karma for Test Runner, and Jasmine and Mocha. So the unit testing story around Angular is quite strong. So when would you not want to use Angular? I would say that the times when you don't want to use Angular would be if your business is based on SEO. So if you've got a business that is primarily just about getting traffic, real estate business, or something similar, then you might want to consider rendering all of your HTML on the server so that you get better SEO. Yes, you can do pre-rendering with Angular, but it doesn't come out of the box. It's a bit of work. So that's one reason why you might decide not to use it. You might consider your team's experience. So if your team has got no experience with Angular, then maybe you're better off using MVC as a .NET shop because you're more used to writing Razor pages. But this is really changing. If you'd asked me this a year ago, I would have said, yeah, it's not so easy to find people who are experienced with Angular, but now you're probably easier to find people with experience with Angular than any other framework. And maybe if you have a very simple UI that's easier to scaffold with MVC scaffolding and templating. And that's still something I hear from .NET shops, that they still render some of their forms and admin forms with MVC and scaffold it out because it's just faster. And that's a fine case, and you might have both. You might have some MVC and some Angular together, which is something we do frequently. So all of this means that you save time and money, and you write a lot less code and a lot less boilerplate with Angular. And this is why it's so popular and why so many people made the decision to use it. And if you're starting a new project at the moment with Angular, you'll probably, or even if you're not starting with Angular, you're just about to start a new project and your team's making the decision what framework should use for the front end, I bet you Angular will come up as one of those potentials, because it's just so good at solving that problem for us of having a strong framework on the front end. So once you've decided to use Angular, that's kind of, one of your big first questions. Then you'd move on to going, how am I going to structure my Angular application? And well, what is architecture? I would say architecture, to me, architecture is the stuff that's difficult to change. And when I talk to people about what it is they found most difficult using Angular, or what they most say to people if they're going file new project with .NET and Angular, the thing I hear the most is, I really wish that we all got together at the start and got our architecture right. And because it's difficult to change later, and I've been on projects where people are making service calls from their UI, and they're making service calls to their backend from their controllers, and then they're writing services as well that make calls to their backend, and they need to change that one service, and now they have to change all across their application rather than following best practices and pushing all that server communication into one spot and having a nice separation of concerns and single responsibility. So if you have a look at this folder structure here and have a think about which one you would prefer. So on the left here, we have a folder structure that's based on feature. So we have an app folder, and in that app folder we have a people folder, and anything to do with people for this Angular application is in here. So we have the people controller and the people view and the people unit tests and the routing and all those sorts of things. So this is one very popular way of doing your Angular apps. So this is kind of like by component. And then on the right, you've got another way of doing it where you do it more by the function that file has. So over here would have the similar app folder, but then would have a controller and a views folder. So you would have all the controllers for your Angular application, and not just one controller for that function. So you'd have controllers for attendees and sessions and speakers and people and all the different functions or features of your application. So if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said, well, either one you want to do is fine. They both work great. There's no real standard. But now, looking at what's coming with the new component router with Angular 2, I would say you want to choose the one on the left, because the new component router expects to find a component folder, and in that folder it expects to find the route that you're calling, or the component, and it will expect to find, for example, a people folder, and in there it'll expect to find a controller named people, and it'll expect to find a view called people as well. And if you do it that way, it'll write up and configure your routing for you with very little code. So that is one tip that I'll give you, is to say I would be moving more towards setting up my application by feature rather than by function in my folder structure. So this is a real life example here of a project that we've built for a client, and you can see we have an app folder, and we push all of our Angular logic into this app folder. So if you need to change anything with Angular, it's going to be here. And you can see the other kind of .NET related controllers underneath this in a separate folder. And we push all of that into there. You can see we have a services layer and a data services layer, and we have a core and business and components, and it's nicely separated out. On the right here, you can see if you imagine this folder structure or directory going all the way down the page, is all of our config for our gulp files as our task runners, and our Karma as our test runner, and we have our spec files and our TS linting files and our web config and all those other sorts of things. So one of the best things you can do to help your style to get your architecture right is to use a style guide, and to sit down with your team at the beginning of your project and do this. And like I said, it's the thing I hear the most from other Angular developers, and the thing that is hardest to change is to make sure that you follow a good plan from the beginning. And if you haven't seen this style guide from John Papa, it has even more than 7,000 likes now. I think it's up to 10,000, which is more than TypeScript has on GitHub. It's amazing how popular this style guide is. You should read it. If you're new to Angular, or you've been doing Angular and you haven't read it, grab a teammate and go through it. It's definitely a huge amount of great learning there from a lot of people's input and best way to structure an Angular application. And we don't necessarily follow everything to the dot at SSW. One example is we do services as services versus services as factories, because we're using TypeScript when we make our Angular applications. But we use almost everything else from this style guide. So worthwhile sitting down at the beginning and following that. So we don't tend to use templates at SSW, although they're great, they're fast for setting up. There's a lot of existing structure to copy. They're great for Hello World. We don't tend to use them because they're not Angular 2 ready. There's no good ones with TypeScript. There's a lot of unnecessary code from project to project. You tend to spend as much time using pre-made code from a template as you do pulling it out, and they usually become redundant pretty fast. So I tend, and everyone else at SSW tend not to use templates for doing our structure. So moving on to the third question, that there's lots of questions you have to ask, but this is one of the big ones that you're going to need to ask yourself if you're going to file a new project as a .NET developer with Angular at the moment. Angular 1 in particular. So will you use TypeScript or will you use ECMAScript 6? So this question, ECMAScript 6 or TypeScript, which one will you use? Because if you're writing JavaScript next year, you should be using one of these. You should be either using ECMAScript 6 or TypeScript. And it's important to remember TypeScript is just a superset of ES6. So when you write it, if you're not using any of the typings, it's just JavaScript. And it has this extra ability of having strong typing and a few other features I'll talk about in a second. So ECMAScript 6 is the latest version of JavaScript. It's been released, we should all be using it. It's one of the biggest upgrades to the language ever, and it's the first upgrade since 2009. And people are also calling it JavaScript 2015, and next year they'll call it JavaScript 2016 and so forth. But I'm going to call it ECMAScript 6 for the rest of this talk. So you get lots of new features. Like I said, it's the biggest upgrade probably ever. And there's too many to go through here, but there's lots of fantastic things that I've really enjoyed using, like fat arrows and classes in my JavaScript, and module loading and template strings and destructuring and the let word. If you haven't seen these, I highly recommend checking it out and moving towards ES6. We should all be using it. So the easiest way to decide whether or not you're going to use ES6 or TypeScript is to think about whether you want strong typing. So and whether or not you want to transpile. If you're using ES5 at the moment, which we're all used to, you don't have to transpile, which means you don't have to compile your ES5 down into a lower version for browsers. Most of the browsers will just handle ES5. But if you're going to move to either of these two guys, ECMAScript 6 or TypeScript, these will both require you to transpile down to ES5 so that you can use it in all the modern browsers and some of the older browsers. Now the next decision from here, if you decide to use ES6 or TypeScript, is do you want strong typing? So if you're going to use ES6 with no TypeScript, you're not going to get strong types. If you use TypeScript, you'll get strong typing. So this is really the decision point. And it's not black and white. You might use either or. I definitely have a preference for TypeScript, and I'll tell you why in a second. And there's more to TypeScript than just types, but this is probably the biggest way of conceptualizing which decision you'll make. So if you're going to use ES6 or you're going to use TypeScript, you're going to need to transpile it, and the most popular transpiler for ES6 is Babel, and that's because it makes the most readable ES5 that it transpiles down to. And if you're going to use TypeScript, it has its own compiler, so you'll just use that. This is a really handy chart showing you the compatibility of different browsers and different compilers with ES6 features. And you can see here the reason why we're going to need to transpile. This is just one reason. Only 10% of the features in ES6 are going to be supported in Internet Explorer 10. So only 10%. So that's why we're going to need to have transpilers for many years to come. If you use the Babel transpiler, you'll get about 71% of the ES6 features, and if you use TypeScript, you'll get about 52%. But really, for me, this 71, 52, it's not really part of the decision making for me. Almost all the features you want from ES6 are going to be in TypeScript, and if you use TypeScript and you transpile down to ES6, then you can use most of the ES6 features as well. It's just only a certain amount of TypeScript features will transpile to ES5, and that's something you can configure. But there's not really anything missing from TypeScript that you wish that you can get from Babel, but there's extras that you can get from TypeScript that you can't get from using ES6 with Babel. And some of those features, these non-ES6 features that you'll get with TypeScript, include some great tooling like auto-completion. You pull in a definitely typed file, which is a specific file for a certain library like Angular, and then you'll be able to get auto-completion inside your project. You get refactoring tools, and a lot of people, when they start thinking about using TypeScript, like, I don't see really much of the benefit. I can do it all with ES6. But these refactoring tools are a really big part of it. Being able to right-click and go to definition and see all the usages of a function or of a property and rename it with confidence is huge. So refactoring is lightning quick and very fun with TypeScript, whereas in a really big enterprise application with just straight JavaScript, trying to do a search on strings can be a bit scary. You get public and private variables, you get interfaces, you get enums, you get generics, you get optional properties, and you get tuple types. So a lot of these things in TypeScript will be very familiar to someone who uses a backend that's object-oriented, like C# with strong typing. And I see these sorts of .NET shops use TypeScript very quickly with a bit of training. But TypeScript's becoming very popular across the board, not just with C# users. And it's important to remember types are optional, and TypeScript itself is like a volume control. If you want to use TypeScript, you don't have to use the typing. You can change the extension of the file from a .js to a .ts file, and what you'll get is just TypeScript written like JavaScript. And then you might wind up the dial a bit. You might use an interface. You might type a property as a string, and then you can't use it as an integer anymore. Or you might really type the heck out of your application, wind it up to 10, and everything's strongly typed. It's up to you. So that's a really good thing. It makes it easy to get into and then turn around if you don't like it. But it's rare that I meet a developer who's used TypeScript for a project that wants to turn around and not use it anymore. And in Angular 1 versus Angular 2, it's going to be a big part of the story. In Angular 1, when we have a controller like this, we put all of our business logic in a function. In Angular 2, we're going to put all of our business logic in a JavaScript class. And if you're writing TypeScript, you would have been writing JavaScript classes like this for ever since you started using TypeScript, because it's kind of how TypeScript works. You've had this ES6 function of JavaScript classes for a fair bit of time. And it's one way to be Angular 2 ready, is use TypeScript now in your Angular 1 applications. So at SSW, we recommend TypeScript. And the main reason we do is for the static types and the compile time checking. It's hard to express if you haven't used it, because it sounds so simple. It doesn't sound that amazing. But when you're doing a lot of dev all day long and you're changing property names and you're writing out like miles and miles of JavaScript or TypeScript, getting this compile time checking really helps. I frequently make silly mistakes on spelling or casing or forgetting to inject something or using something as an object when it's a string and so forth. And I can't express how useful that is. The tooling is amazing. Refactoring is the biggest benefit. IntelliSense is great, but the go-to definition and refactoring is by far the shining benefit, besides the compile time checking. You get ES6 features plus new features like decorators. You get interfaces, which are very handy, and you're going to be Angular 2 ready. So benefiting from TypeScript with Angular 1 can come at a bit of a cost though. There's quite a big learning curve, and if you're OCD, you've got to deal with this. I'm going to kind of type my application. I don't have to fully type everything, and for some people it can feel like smashing a square peg in a round hole. But once you get your head around it, it's very quick. And I've had teams that we've taken who have done no TypeScript and no Angular and written them an application and then given them control and trained them up, and they've very quickly been able to move from doing no TypeScript to TypeScript very quickly, because they're a .NET shop and they're very used to a typed language. So the learning curve can be fixed by some good teaching. So how do you integrate with third-party tools? Another problem. Almost all the examples with TypeScript and Angular 1 are in JavaScript, but I think we're going to see that change with Angular 2, but it's still a challenge. And there's a steep learning curve, like I said. So that's one other big question. Will you use TypeScript or not? And then we move on to the next question you'll need to ask is, will you use the task runner and package managers versus NuGet? And a lot of you are probably already going, oh, I'm doing this stuff, which is great. But if you're not, you should really be considering this. So will you use Bower and NPM versus NuGet for your JavaScript libraries as your package manager? And I would be saying you should definitely be doing this. Microsoft have announced they're not going to support updating their NuGet packages for JavaScript libraries. NuGet's only going to be for C# libraries. And so you're not going to get the latest version if you're using NuGet. And you currently usually wait a couple of days for the latest version as well, because people at Microsoft have to manually go update the NuGet references. You get great tooling and automation. I haven't written a reference for a JavaScript file in my index page in about 6 months, because I have tooling that will run a task in Gulp that will just put that reference from my Bower file into my index page for me. It's easy to install. If you're installing the project on someone else's machine, you can just go Bower install npm install like the rest of the .NET world do, and you can get up and running quite quickly. And you get a lot more control. Some of the downsides are not really that big. You don't have your NuGet installer, you have command line tools, and there's a bit of more setup and learning the first time you do it, but once you've done it once, it's a piece of cake. So at SSW, we tend to use these. We use NPM for our JavaScript libraries that are based on our build dependencies, like things for running our task managers. We use Bower for our front-end libraries like Angular and jQuery. And we use the definitely typed package manager for our definitely typed files, which is what you need to bring in to get IntelliSense or auto-completion on your TypeScript. And we do that by command line as well. You'd go tsd install Angular, and it'll bring in that file for you. So once you're using the right package managers, you need to decide, will you use a task runner like Gulp.js? And we now need to have a build process for our front ends, not just our back ends. Things are getting more complicated. And you can get away without having a build process on your front end, but next year it's probably going to be much trickier if you move on to a project that's going to be using ES6 or TypeScript like Angular 2, and you'll need to have that. And also it's just the time saving and the lack of mistakes. If you set up a task that will go add all your references to your index page, or you have a task that's going to execute your minification and packaging up your application for deployment, then that is going to be much more reliable than you going through a series of clicks every time. So the main choice is between using Gulp or Grunt, and we use Gulp at SSW, and I'll show you why for a couple of reasons, although both work very well. Gulp is stream-based, so you're going to get better performance versus Grunt, which is file-based. So you might perform 6 tasks with Gulp, and you can perform them in a stream, so you don't read and write to disk, and then at the end you can do your read and write. Whereas with Grunt, every single step in your tasks, you're going to need to do that read and write step, so it's more performant. You're using code over configuration versus configuration over code with Grunt. And as developers, I much prefer writing code. I much prefer to put a function in there to extend my task in Gulp than not being able to. There's about 1,500 plugins with Gulp, and there's about 3,000 with Grunt, but that's not really too much part of the decision for me, because I really haven't missed a plugin that I could get with Grunt that I can't get with Gulp. And these numbers are probably getting a little bit out of date, and it's probably becoming more equal. And Microsoft also shipped their new ASP.NET 5 projects, which need to have a build task to be able to use with Gulp, and they originally had Grunt. So I think the whole world's kind of moving towards Gulp. But it's also good to be aware that although we use Gulp at the moment and NPM and Bower, there is some newer stuff coming out that looks very promising that people are using quite successfully already. One's JSPM, which is like a package manager and a module loader all in one. And then you've got Webpack, which does what it says. It packs up your application ready for deployment. And these look really great, and I've used both of them a small amount and have really enjoyed them, and I think we're going to see more of these two guys in the future. But currently with our Angular 1 applications, we're not doing any module loading, so we're using Gulp for all of our tasks and to getting our projects ready for deployment. There's a new Visual Studio Task Runner Explorer. If you haven't seen it, I recommend checking it out. You can set up like this. You can say, okay, I want to have on build, I want to bind before build this task, and it will execute that task for you. And every time you go Control-Shift-B, it will kick off your watches, or it'll build your application and make sure you've minified and transpiled all of your code, which is really handy. When I first saw this, I won't use it that much, but I use Control-Shift-B quite a lot now, rather than opening up my console and running build. So once you've got your head around using task runners and you've got your package management all set up, the next question you're going to need to ask is, how are you going to get ready for Angular 2? Angular 2 is currently in alpha. It's close to being ready for beta, and although the release date hasn't actually been released right now, it's something to be ready for. And if you haven't started learning Angular 2, you should start checking it out. So what's missing in Angular 1? Well, module loading is definitely one of the big parts of it. So right now it's very difficult to do asynchronous loading in Angular 1, and you have to do some hacks. So if you want to load part of your application on initial page load, and then when you route to another section of your application, load another part, then that's kind of tricky to do in Angular 1. It doesn't come out of the box. You don't get simple directives. Directives are fantastic, writing custom components, but they're a big brain bend, and they take a fair while to understand and decipher when you're editing other people's directives and managing the scope between childs and parents. But this is going to get much easier. Also, performance is a bit of an issue. Most of us have found Angular 1 to be more than performant enough, but if you get lots of bindings on a page and a really big application, it can slow down. And an easier mental map. It's a huge learning curve learning Angular 1, and although there's a fair bit to learn in Angular 2, once we get our heads around it, I think it's going to be easier to use. So in Angular 2, there's no more two-way data binding, and this is to improve performance, removing the digest cycle and just having a one-directional flow of data. And there's some new syntax, though, that's going to help us achieve two-way data binding by combining a property and events onto the same item here. So in this input, you can see that you're doing a property binding with the square brackets, and then you're doing a event binding with the parentheses. So this, in a sense, is just like two-way data binding without the performance downsides that were in Angular 1. TypeScript will become the default language in Angular 2, which is great for all the reasons I said, refactoring and IntelliSense and all those sorts of stuff. But you're also going to get these decorators, which aren't a feature of ES6, they're a feature of ECMAScript 7. And these decorators are going to allow us to do many things and write much cleaner code. And one of those is to have improved dependency injection. So we used to have to do these huge lists of strings. This is a real life example of a project I'm working on where I'm going to inject all these things into my controller, and to make it minification safe, I'm either going to have to do something like this, where I go static $inject, and here's a list of strings, or I had to do a build step with ng-annotate, which would go and put these on after I've written my code. Either way, it was a bit messy, but now we get this ability to get at inject with a decorator, and then we'll be getting strong typing for what we want to inject, like electricity. So this is great and a big improvement. There'll be no more controllers. There will only be components in Angular 2, and a component will have a view, and it will have a JavaScript class for its functionality and a bunch of other stuff, but they're the main things that it'll have. So you'll be writing components and using the component router rather than writing controllers. And this new component router is going to be fantastic. It's going to have all the other functionality we had with the other router, but it'll also be able to handle nested routes and auxiliary routes, and a lot of the things we depended on the third-party Angular UI router, which we use predominantly with our Angular 1 apps at the moment versus the default router that comes with Angular. Angular 2 is also going to use ES6 modules, which is great. This is going to give us the ability to do that asynchronous loading that I mentioned. So we'll be able to load part of our application up front and then reload the next part of the application when we go to that part. So that's fantastic, and it's going to be something that was really missing from Angular 1. And it's going to open up room for new tools like I mentioned before with JSPM and Webpack. Also, Angular 2 is going to have observables, and they're going to have a dependency on the RxJS library, which is great. We're going to write more pleasurable code to write, and our code's going to be much more performant. So I highly recommend checking out observables. If you haven't checked them out already, it's going to be a different way. You're not going to go .then on your callbacks with your HTTP gets. You're going to use an observable. So there's a lot of change coming, but I think once we get our heads around it, it's going to be for the better, and Angular 2 is going to be much more fun to use. So if you want to be ready for it, I think the things to do is use TypeScript with ES6 classes. Use the new component router when it's ready. I was hoping to see it come in Angular 1.4. Maybe it'll be the 1.5 or 1.6, but when it's ready, I think we should use it, and it's going to be the same router that will be used in Angular 2. Have a component-based project structure. Don't put things in a controller folder, put them in a feature folder, like I said before. Have a front-end build process with Gulp or something similar. And this is going to be a must with Angular 2, so it's good to get your head around it now, and also make your dev more fun and consistent. And componentize your app. Try and write everything as directives. That's kind of how it'll be with Angular 2. Now there's some new stuff coming that they've announced, that Angular will be able to have Angular 1 and 2 in the same app. So this is pretty good news, because if you've got a really large code base with Angular 1, and you're looking at all this cool stuff coming with Angular 2, and you're like, oh, I want to use it to make my app better, but I can't because we can't port the whole thing, not all at once. Well, you can do both at once, which is great. And there's two new tools coming out, one called ng forward and one called ng upgrade. So ng forward is about moving your Angular 1 application forward, as you can see on the left. So you can write Angular 2 syntax in your Angular 1 application, which is great. Upskill your team without having to jump across. And ng upgrade is about, okay, I've finally moved enough of my project with ng forward towards being like Angular 2. Now it's ready to push the whole thing over to Angular 2 and turn off Angular 1. And that's what the upgrade will be for. These things aren't done yet, but this looks like the direction it's going to go. So how do you get and keep up to speed? How are you going to handle all of this change that's coming with Angular? And if you're new to Angular, how are you going to manage what you do learning Angular 1 now? And should you start your project in Angular 1 or should you start your project in Angular 2? Well, there's some great resources for that. Dev Superpowers is a fantastic place to get all the latest information on Angular and TypeScript and Angular 2. So that's worth checking out. Pluralsight, if you haven't seen it, is a mega one-stop shop for all of your digital learning. Highly worth checking out, and they've got some great stuff on Angular. Angular.io is the new Angular website. So if you go to the current Angular 1 website, you'll be going, where's the Angular 2 stuff? It's at angular.io. And egghead.io is probably going to be the people who have the early learning in terms of learning Angular 2. It's worth checking out as well. And also I'd like to announce that we're going to be running a AngularJS Superpowers tour. And we're going to be running that as part of also learning Angular 2 with ASP.NET 5 and MVC 6 within Visual Studio. So if you're a .NET developer and you're about to also learn ASP.NET 5 and Angular 2 is around the corner and this is going to be your stack, then this is the course for you. It's going to be $199. We're running it in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane in November and December. And it's a 2-day training with myself and my colleague Adam Stevenson, and it's going to be great. So if you want to get your head around all of this stuff, then I highly recommend you come check it out. Because one of the biggest problems with learning these things is you go file new project. So example, file new project with ASP.NET 5. You'll spend 2 weeks banging your head against the table, and we've already done that at SSW. We've already got production websites running in ASP.NET 5 with MVC 6. And seriously, we wasted 2 weeks of our time getting set up. So if you want to save yourself 2 weeks of headache going file a new project with these new technologies and see best practices with enterprise architecture, then come join us. It'll be a jam-packed 2 days, and you'll get to see everything with Angular 1 and Angular 2 and all the changes from ASP.NET 4 to 5. So you'll learn structure, you'll learn about Angular 2 forms, components, services, and the new component router, ASP.NET 5 and Visual Studio 2015, and we'll talk a lot about deployment from front-end packaging to back-end deployment and automation with tools like TeamCity and Octopus Deploy. So in summary from today, I would say that you should use Angular if you're close to making that decision. I think it's a great framework. I think Angular 2 is going to be super performant and a pleasure to use and strongly supported, and you'll probably find that it'll get to the point where 1 million people are going to the Angular 2 website every day in no time. You should pay attention to how you structure your application and use a style guide. You should use TypeScript or ECMAScript 6 with a preference to TypeScript if you're going to be doing an enterprise application. I think you should be using a task runner and package managers now, and if you're not, you're really missing out. It makes your dev a lot more enjoyable and a lot more predictable. And I think that you should follow the steps that I mentioned to get ready for Angular 2. And if you haven't picked up Angular 2 yet, I think you should start learning. Now's a great time. The API is getting much more solid, and it's going to be in beta, hopefully in a very short time. So hopefully I've helped us move forward to our goal, which is to have our front-end code be as solid as our back-end code. So thank you very much for watching. Cheers.